The storm hadn't even reached its peak when Ethan Cole, a 58-year-old former Navy SEAL who'd spent years hiding from his past, felt the earth move beneath his boots. Not a quake, not thunder. Something deeper, something alive. His German shepherd, Atlas, stood rigid in the rain, staring up at Whistler Ridge as if he saw a ghost clawing its way out of the mountain. And then the ground split open. A breath of air, ice-cold, stale, carrying the scent of years that never saw daylight, rose from a darkening sinkhole. Ethan knew that smell. He'd breathed it once in a collapsed bunker in Afghanistan, moments before losing the youngest man under his command. Now it was rising from his own backyard, and Atlas, trembling but unyielding, refused to let him turn away. What they would uncover beneath that mountain, what had been waiting nearly 30 years, would drag Ethan back into the darkness he thought he'd escaped, and give him one last chance to set a broken story right. Before we continue, tell me where you're listening from, or type Amen for everyone still waiting for their truth to be found. The storm had arrived early that night, rolling over Twin Pines, Montana, with a kind of deliberate menace that made the windows of Ethan Cole's cabin tremble in their frames. Thunder crawled across the Bitterroot Range like an iron chain dragged by some unseen beast. Inside the modest wooden cabin, lit only by the warm amber glow of a single kerosene lamp, Ethan Cole, a 58-year-old former Navy SEAL, stood quietly by the window, watching the dark timberline as if searching for ghosts he refused to name. His face, angular, weather-toughened, with creases deepened by decades of sun, battle, and sleepless nights, remained still. Ethan's hair, once jet black during his SEAL years, was now a rugged mix of gray and charcoal, cropped short on the sides, but with a few rebellious strands falling toward his brow. A trimmed but stubborn stubble covered his jawline, giving him the familiar look of a man who hadn't fully decided whether he lived in the world of civilians or in the memory of combat operations long past. PTSD had carved a permanent shadow behind his steady eyes, a shadow that flickered whenever thunder shook the sky. Ethan had tried to escape noise, war noise, city noise, memory noise, and that was why he lived here, in the last cabin before the mountain swallowed the road. Behind him, lying on the braided rug, was Atlas, his 5-year-old German shepherd. Atlas had the kind of commanding presence that made strangers straighten their posture. He carried a thick coat of storm-colored fur, a striking blend of smoky gray and near-black streaks running along his spine. His ears were always alert, tipped forward like parabolic antennas tuned to frequencies Ethan could never hear. Atlas wasn't just a companion. He had been assigned to Ethan years ago as a therapy dog, after a disastrous extraction mission in Helmand Province left Ethan half buried in a collapsed mud brick compound. The dog's loyalty had pulled Ethan through nights when memories became enemies. Tonight, however, Atlas wasn't resting. He was pacing, slow, tense, deliberate. Every few seconds he would stop at the front door, stare up at Whistler Ridge, then glance back at Ethan with an expression of urgency only a German shepherd could make understandable without words. The ridge stood against the storm like a black wall, jagged peaks slicing the sky. Locals spoke about it in lowered voices, not because of superstition, but because memory itself carried weight. The landslide of 1994 had taken part of the mountainside, and 3 lives with it. A sudden bolt of lightning cracked open the sky, illuminating Atlas's tense posture. The dog's fur bristled along his neck, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Ethan turned from the window, frowning. "What is it, boy?" His voice, gravelly and low, carried the tone of a man used to making calm sound like command. Atlas didn't bark. Instead, he stepped onto the wooden threshold of the porch, muscles drawn tight, like bowstrings. Rain pelted his coat, flattening the thick fur into sleek, dark waves, but he didn't flinch or move to retreat into warmth. He simply stared toward the ridge, unblinking. Thunder shook the cabin again, and with it came the familiar tightening in Ethan's chest. The air pressure, the vibration, the split-second flash of white. His mind twisted briefly, trying to pull him back into memories of collapsing walls and shouts drowned by dust. He steadied himself against the doorframe, forcing his breath into slow, practiced counts. 1, 2, 3. "You're here, Cole." But the storm outside demanded more than grounding exercises. Atlas stepped backward, nudging Ethan's thigh with his wet snout, then pushed forward again, urging him out the door with unmistakable insistence. Ethan grabbed his rain jacket, an old navy blue field shell with frayed cuffs, and stepped onto the porch. The storm swallowed him instantly. Rain slapped against his face in cold sheets, running down the wrinkles around his eyes. He pulled his hood up, though the wind nearly snatched it off. Atlas trotted ahead, stopping only when he reached the beginning of the narrow path leading into the timber. The dog turned his head back, eyes burning with a strange intensity, sharper than fear, sharper than instinct. Ethan had seen that look once. Years ago, when Atlas had alerted him to an IED buried beneath a thin layer of dust on a rural Afghan road. That look had saved 5 men. Tonight, it was aimed at the mountain. "You're telling me we need to go," Ethan murmured, almost amused, despite the storm pounding around them. Atlas didn't move, just shifted his stance into a straighter, stiffer posture, a soldier awaiting a command. Ethan took a step off the porch. The mud swallowed the heel of his boot with a wet suction sound. Another step, another rumble of thunder. Atlas led the way slowly, ensuring Ethan followed. The rain blurred the forest into smudges of gray and black, the air thick with the scent of wet pine and churned soil. A third of the way down the path, a deep tremor rippled beneath Ethan's feet. Not the quick jolt of a quake. This was slower, heavier, like the ground was inhaling. Ethan froze. Atlas's ears shot upright, his body stiff as a board. A long, low moan rose from the direction of Whistler Ridge, almost too deep to be a sound. It felt more like pressure traveling through the earth. Then it happened. A crack split the forest floor ahead, sharp as breaking bone. The ground heaved once, violently enough that Ethan had to catch a tree trunk to stay upright. A seam of earth tore open across the path, no wider than a hand at first. But from it rose a gust of air so cold Ethan staggered back. It was the kind of cold that didn't feel like weather. It felt like something sealed, air that had been trapped without moonlight or warmth for far too long. The smell followed, stale, metallic, touched faintly with something sweet and wrong. Ethan had smelled it before, in collapsed bunkers, in abandoned tunnels where men had waited too long for a rescue that never came. Atlas emitted a long, sorrowful whine, hovering near the edge of the fissure, but refusing to touch it. The dog's body quivered, his tail low but stiff, as if he were standing on a gravesite that had just exhaled. Ethan stepped closer, careful not to place weight on the unstable soil. The fissure seemed to pulse, expanding slightly with each rumble of distant thunder, like the mountain itself was breathing. A chill raced down Ethan's spine, not from the storm, but from recognition. Something down there had awakened, something old, something that did not belong in the open air. Atlas looked up at Ethan, eyes glowing in the lightning flash. The message was clear. They needed to act. Ethan scanned the ridge once more, listening to the storm roar through the treetops. He didn't know what was beneath them yet. But his instincts, sharpened by decades of surviving what should have killed him, whispered the same truth Atlas already knew. Something under that mountain had just come back to life. Morning arrived not with sunlight, but with a washed-out grayness that looked as though the storm had squeezed all color from the world. Overnight rain still dripped from the eaves of Ethan's cabin, tapping out a steady rhythm on the metal gutters, as if reminding him that the mountain had not finished speaking. Ethan Cole stood on the porch with a coil of climbing rope slung over his shoulder, a tactical flashlight clipped to his belt, and a survival knife sheathed at his hip. His posture was rigid, the stiffness not from the cold, but from the restless memory of what he and Atlas had witnessed the night before. The earth breathing, the fissure exhaling like a wounded beast waking after decades of sleep. Atlas waited at the base of the steps, sitting tall and alert. Even at rest, the German shepherd's muscles formed defined, powerful lines beneath his thick fur. Mud from last night had dried along his paws in dark crusts. His amber eyes were fixed on the tree line, watching the path leading toward Whistler Ridge with unwavering intensity. The dog seemed older today, not in age, but in gravity, like he had taken on a duty far beyond instinct. Ethan clipped a carabiner to his belt and gave Atlas a nod. "Lead," he said simply. Atlas didn't hesitate. He rose in one smooth motion and started for the woods. The path was slick with runoff, pine needles plastered against the mud as if the forest had shed its skin overnight. Ethan stepped carefully, adjusting the rope across his shoulder. His boots sank slightly into the ground with each step, releasing the tangy scent of soaked earth. Atlas trotted ahead, occasionally lowering his nose to the ground and inhaling deeply, following something Ethan couldn't sense. The dog's gait was determined, purposeful. Ethan noted the way Atlas moved, not as though he were tracking a deer or following a familiar trail, but as if something was calling him forward. Halfway up the ridge, the trees thinned, bent unnaturally by the previous night's gale. Several young lodgepole pines lay toppled, their exposed roots dark and claw-like. As Ethan stepped around one, he noticed the sharp, splintered trunk, a fresh break. Not rot, not time, pressure. The earth had shifted violently. Atlas suddenly stopped. Every line in the dog's body went rigid. His tail froze mid-swing, and his ears angled sharply toward the ridge. Ethan felt it before he heard it. A low, almost inaudible groan from beneath the soil. It was not the sound of wind, nor the creaking of rooted trees. It was deeper, atmospheric, the kind of sound felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. Ethan inhaled sharply, the cold air flooding his lungs with the unmistakable sting of high-altitude frost. He took one step forward and saw it. The ground ahead dipped into a wide depression he hadn't noticed in the dark last night. As he approached, the depression transformed into something more deliberate, more ominous. A sinkhole. One large, enough to swallow a pickup truck. The edges were raw and torn, still slick from the recent storm. Soil clumped loosely at the rim, sliding downward in slow, reluctant cascades. At the center of the sinkhole was a void, a perfectly circular vertical shaft plunging into darkness. Air seeped from it, not in a warm upward draft, but in an icy exhalation, as though something far below was pushing out the breath it had been holding for years. Atlas padded to the edge, though he stayed far enough back that his paws wouldn't break the unstable ground. He lowered his head, nostrils flaring. A deep, mournful sound rose from his throat, a sound Ethan had never heard from him before. It wasn't a warning growl, nor the panicked whine of fear. It was grief. Ancient, untranslatable grief. Ethan crouched several feet from the edge, resting his hand on the ground to steady himself. A shiver ran through his fingertips, an unnatural cold that seeped upward. He clicked on his flashlight and angled the beam down the shaft. The light cut through the gloom, revealing walls coated with wet clay and fractured rock. About 15 feet down, the dirt appeared disturbed, loosened, scraped, as if something heavy had hit the ground with force long before the shaft had widened to this gaping maw. He leaned closer, careful not to put weight on the fragile rim. The flashlight beam drew faint outlines, no shape recognizable enough to name, but the patterning was clear. Something had fallen. Something large. Something that had been buried by time until the storm peeled back the scar. The moment Ethan saw the disturbed soil, a memory detonated behind his eyes. Afghanistan, 12 years earlier. A collapsed mud brick dwelling, dust thick enough to choke on. A young SEAL, barely 21, with sandy blonde hair and a nervous, eager smile. Luke Maddox. Ethan had brought Luke onto the team himself, choosing him for his quiet discipline and sharp mind. They'd been clearing a structure when the roof had given way. Ethan had crawled out. Luke had not. The mission commander ordered retreat, claiming the remaining structure was too unstable to dig through. Ethan had obeyed. He still heard Luke's muffled cry through the dust, fading into an impossible silence. His jaw clenched, and he blinked the memory away. But the sensation remained. This same smell, this same pressure in the air, the same cold rising from a sealed pocket beneath the ground. Luke's ghost wasn't here, but something very similar was. Atlas nudged Ethan's shoulder gently, pulling him back from the edge. The dog's eyes were different now, wide, urgent, almost pleading. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he whispered. "I feel it too." He rose to his feet and scanned the sinkhole, analyzing the angle of the exposed roots and the curvature of the shaft, like a combat engineer assessing a collapsed structure. The mountain had opened a window that wouldn't remain open for long. A gust of frigid air rose from the depths, rushing across Ethan's cheek. It carried something metallic, something old, something untouched by daylight for far too long. The scent tightened Ethan's chest. "Time," he muttered. "This is the smell of time. Trapped." Atlas suddenly lifted his head and released a long, trembling howl, one that rippled through the trees and disappeared into the broken sky above. It raised every hair on Ethan's arms. It was not a dog's call. It was a lament. Ethan stared into the pit, his stomach sinking like a stone. He didn't know what was buried beneath Whistler Ridge, but the land itself felt heavier with the weight of it. The earth was trying to tell him a story it had been forced to keep secret for years. He backed away carefully, pulling Atlas with him. "We're coming back," Ethan said softly. "Not today, but soon." Atlas stepped closer, resting his head briefly against Ethan's hip. "Yes," Ethan whispered, eyes locked on the breathing hole in the earth. "We have to." The drive into Twin Pines took longer than usual. The storm had left the back roads covered in broken branches, sheets of wet leaves, and small slides of mud that forced Ethan to ease his battered Ford along the winding descent. Atlas sat upright in the passenger seat, never lying down, his front paws pressed firmly against the rubber floor mat, ears twitching at every crackle of the radio static. The dog's posture mirrored Ethan's state of mind, tense, alert, carrying the weight of something they had both sensed beneath Whistler Ridge. Twin Pines in the daylight looked different from the town Ethan remembered from his early years in Montana. The storm had sucked the color from the place, leaving buildings appearing older, more worn, as if time had pulled tight on everything overnight. The grocery store sign flickered weakly. The diner's parking lot was empty, and a pair of elderly men stood beneath the overhang of O'Malley's Hardware, smoking silently with the seriousness of men waiting for news that wasn't going to be good. Ethan parked outside the Twin Pines Public Library, a squat one-story brick building with faded green shutters and a front door that creaked like something out of an old Western movie. He had spent a good portion of his teenage years here, back when he still thought he might go to college instead of enlisting. The familiarity steadied him. He stepped inside, the warmth wrapping around him like a blanket. Behind the circulation desk sat Evelyn Harper, the town's longtime librarian. She was in her late 60s, with short steel-gray hair curled neatly around a gentle, oval face that still held the softness of someone who had spent decades speaking quietly in rooms full of books. Her glasses hung from a beaded chain, and the cardigan she wore, deep forest green, looked hand-knitted. Evelyn had the appearance of a woman who never raised her voice but whose resolve was stronger than most men Ethan had served with. She looked up when she heard the bell on the door, recognition dawning across her features. "Well, I'll be," she said, her voice like warm tea. "Ethan Cole. Haven't seen you in a while. I figured you'd gone all hermit on us." Ethan managed a faint smile. "Guess I have. How are you doing, Evelyn?" Her eyes flicked toward Atlas, who stood calmly beside Ethan, tail still, gaze observant but polite. "And who's this fine-looking boy?" "This is Atlas," Ethan said. "He's with me." She nodded approvingly. "Looks like a smart one. What brings you in today?" Ethan hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I need to look at old town records, specifically from 1994. A shadow crossed Evelyn's face. It was subtle, but Ethan noticed it instantly. "That was a hard year for Twin Pines," she murmured. "A terrible landslide broke the whole town's heart." She motioned for him to follow. "Come on. The archives are in the back room." The archive room smelled of paper, dust, and old glue, the scent of forgotten years. Metal filing cabinets lined one wall. Across from them, shelves sagged under the weight of boxed newspapers, school records, and town council minutes, dating as far back as the 1950s. Evelyn moved with surprising agility for her age, pulling down a wide cardboard box labeled Local Events, 1994. As she opened the lid, Ethan caught a glimpse of yellowing headlines, photographs printed on thin newsprint, and handwritten notes from past librarians. Evelyn sorted through the contents with careful fingers before passing Ethan a stack of folded newspapers. "You're looking for the Riley case, aren't you?" she asked softly. Ethan paused. "I think so." "It never left us," she said, taking a seat at the small reading table. "Jacob Riley, only 11. Sweet boy. His mother used to bring him to story time every Tuesday. Smart kid. Brown hair that always stuck up in the back, no matter how she tried to comb it." Evelyn's voice softened further. "And his dog, Bear. A German shepherd. Big fella. Protective. The kind of dog you'd trust with your life. Ethan unfolded the first paper. The headline hit him like a fist. Local boy missing after storm. Search continues for Jacob Riley and his dog. Below the headline was a photo. A boy with bright, earnest eyes, a crooked grin, and a mop of unruly chestnut hair. Standing beside him was Bear, larger than Jacob, with thick sable fur and the proud posture of a loyal guardian. Jacob's small hand gripped the dog's collar, as if he believed Bear could protect him from anything. Ethan stared at the picture too long. Something in the boy's expression, the innocence mixed with adventure, twisted his chest. He forced himself to keep reading. According to the article, Jacob and Bear were last seen near the riverbank. Heavy rainfall that year had caused rapid flooding, and the sheriff's department believed the two were swept away in the current. But Ethan had been near the river countless times during storms. The scent of the sinkhole was not river silt, not rot, not algae. It was something older, entombed. Ethan flipped through more pages. Another report mentioned that search teams had found no footprints, no clothing, no remains. The river explanation was convenient, tidy, too tidy. Evelyn watched him closely. "You're thinking it wasn't the river?" Ethan met her gaze. "The evidence doesn't match. Something opened on the ridge last night. Something that shouldn't be there." Her brows knitted. For a moment she looked like a woman torn between the desire to help and the fear of reviving a wound the town had spent decades trying to bury. At last she said, "Be careful, Ethan. Some truths get twisted when you dig too deep. And that mountain, it's taken enough from us." He nodded, gathered the papers, and returned them gently to the box. "Thanks, Evelyn. I'll bring everything back exactly how I found it." As he turned to leave, the door to the archive room buzzed faintly. A radio mounted above the desk crackled to life, its speaker hissing before the automated weather report cut through. "Emergency advisory for Ravalli County. Atmospheric river level 5 expected to hit within 48 hours. Residents advised to stay off mountain roads and avoid unstable slopes." Ethan stilled. Level 5 was rare, catastrophic. Enough water to liquefy soil, rip apart root systems, bring entire hillsides down. If the sinkhole collapsed completely, whatever was inside it would vanish again, this time forever. Ethan grabbed Atlas's leash. "We don't have days," he muttered. "We don't even have a night." Evelyn stepped forward, concern pulling at her features. "Ethan, don't go up there in a storm like this." He gave her a grim, weary smile. "I don't have a choice." Atlas waited at the door, eyes fixed on Whistler Ridge beyond the town's rooftops. The boy in the photo seemed to stare from the past, asking for something Ethan didn't yet know how to give. But he knew this much. If he didn't move now, the truth would drown under 30 more years of silence. The storm struck Whistler Ridge with a fury that felt personal, as if the mountain itself had decided to challenge Ethan Cole for daring to uncover its buried secrets. Rain hit the windshield like pebbles flung from a slingshot, and the old Ford shuddered each time a gust of wind slammed against it. Ethan gripped the steering wheel with both hands, knuckles white, jaw set tight. Atlas sat braced in the back seat, paws planted wide, balancing against every lurch of the truck. His thick gray and black fur was raised along his spine, not from cold, but from a sense of urgency that had only grown stronger since they left the library. When Ethan finally reached the end of the trail, the point beyond which no vehicle could pass, he killed the engine and listened. The storm swallowed every sound except the distant low groans of the ridge shifting. He opened the door, and the wind immediately tore at his jacket, flattening the hood against the back of his head. Atlas jumped down beside him, landing softly despite the unstable ground, and immediately faced the path upward, his posture rigid, tail low but not tucked. The dog looked like a creature carved from the storm itself. The climb was slow and punishing. Sheet rain blurred their surroundings into a smear of grays and blacks. The trail they had taken just that morning was now a dangerous river of mud. Pine branches whipped against Ethan's arms, stinging through the soaked fabric of his jacket. More than once, he had to grab at the slick bark of fallen trees to keep from sliding downhill. Atlas moved ahead, but never out of sight, turning back frequently to check on Ethan, eyes reflecting each flicker of lightning with an almost human concern. Halfway up the ridge, a small landslide rushed past them, a slurry of pebbles and loosened dirt that rattled down the slope like marbles poured from a bucket. Ethan froze instinctively, dropping his weight backward while planting his boots into the mud. Atlas pressed close to his leg, ears pinned. When the cascade passed, Ethan exhaled shakily and continued upward. The mountain was telling them something: move fast or not at all. When they reached the clearing surrounding the sinkhole, Ethan stopped short. The hole was larger now, not just wider, but deeper, as though the earth had sucked inward like a giant lung pulling one last breath. Chunks of soil lay scattered around the rim, and each burst of thunder triggered tremors Ethan could feel in the soles of his boots. Atlas stood at the very edge, not dangerously close, but close enough to make the message unmistakable. His chest expanded with a low, vibrating howl that was nearly drowned by the storm. It was not the howl of grief this time. It was a warning. Ethan unclipped the coil of rope from his pack and scanned the nearest tree. The lodgepole pine he chose stood taller than the others, its bark thick and furrowed, trunk stable despite the storm. The tree leaned slightly downhill, but its roots were exposed just enough for him to know they reached deep. He wrapped the rope twice around the trunk, securing it with a figure-8 knot, then tugged 3 times, hard, to test it. It held. Ethan clipped the rappel device to his harness and looped the rope through. For a moment, he paused, letting the rain run over his face. It wasn't fear that rooted him there. It was the weight of memory pressing down on his chest like a stone. The shaft below smelled like the collapsed compound in Afghanistan, where Luke Maddox had breathed his last. Ethan swallowed hard, gripping the rope tight. "Stay here," he told Atlas, though he knew the dog would not move far. Ethan stepped backward off the edge. The world dropped away in a rush of icy air. Water streamed down the rope, soaking his gloves and making the descent slippery. The rocks were slick with runoff. Dirt fell in thin curtains as he rappelled deeper. The flashlight attached to his chest plate cast a pale cone of light that swung with each controlled slide, revealing the shaft's walls: clay, rock, sediment, and pockets of air preserved for decades. At about 15 feet down, a violent tremor shook the shaft. Ethan slammed a boot into the wall to brace himself as loose stones ricocheted past him. His heart hammered. His breaths came faster. The smell hit him next, a dense, humid scent of trapped decay and long-dead oxygen that mirrored the smell of the Afghan tunnel. His vision tunneled, his throat constricted, his fingers stiffened around the rope. PTSD hit him like a freight train. Suddenly he wasn't in Montana. He was back in Helmand, dust choking the air, the sound of collapsing walls, Luke calling his name through the darkness. Ethan's pulse surged. His grip slipped an inch. His chest felt crushed. Another tremor rattled the shaft, sending more debris down on him. Somewhere above, Atlas barked sharply, high-pitched, panicked, but to Ethan it sounded like echoes of the war. For a few seconds, panic owned him completely. Then Atlas barked again, louder, sharper, filled with desperation and command. The bark cut through Ethan's spiraling thoughts like a blade slicing thick rope. His eyes widened. Air came back into his lungs. He forced his hand to unclench, then re-grip the rope. "You're not there," he whispered. "You're here." He pushed downward slowly, refusing to let fear dictate his movement. When his boots finally hit solid ground, he nearly collapsed from the mixture of exhaustion and adrenaline. The alcove at the bottom was larger than he expected. 3 or 4 feet of dry, untouched air had preserved a hollow beneath the debris. The walls of the alcove were smooth in places, almost polished by the flow of ancient runoff. His flashlight beam drifted and landed on something pale. Bones. 2 shapes lay curled together, undisturbed by time. The smaller skeleton, delicate, narrow-ribbed, childlike, was unmistakably human. Beside it, the second skeleton was larger, canine, with strong jawbones and long leg bones still aligned, as if the dog had wrapped itself around the child in a final act of protection. Thick traces of old fur remained matted in some places, preserved unusually well by the cold, dry pocket. Jacob Riley and Bear. The sight gutted Ethan, not because he was unprepared for the possibility, but because of the tenderness frozen into the arrangement of bones. Bear had died holding the boy, protecting him until his last breath. Ethan fell to his knees, the mud soaking through the fabric immediately. Tears blurred his vision, and he did nothing to stop them. The storm outside thundered, crashing against the ridge like the rage of a world that had waited 30 years to be heard. Ethan reached out with trembling fingers and rested his hand against the dry earth near Jacob's remains. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not to the boy, but to every ghost he had carried with him. Luke, Jacob, Bear, and countless others. This was his chance, his moment to finally do something right. The alcove felt smaller once Ethan realized what he needed to do. The storm above intensified, each roll of thunder sending vibrations down the shaft like the heartbeat of a dying giant. Ethan wiped his face with the back of his muddy glove. Though the gesture did nothing, his tears mixed with the dampness of the cavern, blurring his vision. He forced a slow breath, steadying himself the way he had been trained decades ago, then reached for the specialized recovery pouch clipped to his belt. It was a military-grade body retrieval bag, compact but durable, made for harsh terrain. He opened it gently, as if afraid the fabric itself might wound the silence surrounding Jacob Riley and Bear. He knelt beside them with reverence. Jacob's small frame, fragile ribs curved inward like a bird sheltering itself from an unforgiving world, lay pressed against the remains of Bear. The dog's skull rested over the boy's shoulder, as though even death could not loosen the bond between them. Ethan spoke softly, barely audible over the distant rumbling above. "We're getting you both home." His hands, rough and scarred, worked slowly and carefully. He lifted Jacob's bones with a tenderness that surprised even him, arranging them into the padded pouch. Then he slid Bear's remains in as well, positioning the two so they rested together exactly as they had been for nearly 3 decades. A tremor shook dust from the alcove ceiling. Soil trickled from above, landing on Ethan's shoulders in gritty streams. He zipped the pouch, securing it to his harness. "Time to go," he whispered. Atlas barked faintly from above, an anxious, urgent bark. Ethan looked up at the shrinking circle of light from the shaft above him. The edges were crumbling. He gripped the rope, braced his boots against the rock wall, and pushed upward. The climb was harder with the extra weight. His gloves slid on the wet nylon. He tightened his grip, teeth clenched. Halfway up, a deep cracking sound echoed through the shaft. Ethan froze. The light overhead flickered as chunks of soil broke off the rim and tumbled past him. One clod struck his shoulder, nearly throwing him off balance. He gasped, shoving himself harder against the rope. "Just a little more," he muttered. "Move, Cole. Move." The tremors grew stronger. The mountain was closing. Each second stole more of the ridge's stability. The rim folded inward like a closing jaw, shadows creeping across the shaft. Ethan planted his boot, reached upward, and his hand slipped. His glove, soaked through, skidded along the rope. His body lurched sideways. The retrieval pouch swung with him, throwing off his balance. The rope burned against his palm as he slid nearly 2 feet down the wall. "Come on!" Ethan hissed, gritting his teeth. But then the worst happened. His left glove tore. The rope scorched across his bare skin. His fingers spasmed, and suddenly he was dangling with one hand. Above him, Atlas barked, louder than the storm, louder than the collapsing earth. Ethan forced himself to look up. The dog stood at the narrowed rim. Mud splattered across his chest and legs, eyes wide with fear and refusal. Lightning flashed behind him, illuminating his silhouette like some guardian carved from the storm. Another tremor shook the shaft. Ethan's grip faltered. His arm screamed with pain. The retrieval pouch slammed into the wall, throwing him off-center. Soil rained down on him like ashes. The rim was closing fast. He could hear it, feel it, see it. And then Atlas moved. The dog lunged, bracing his hind legs and stretching his body as far as he could without falling in. His jaws snapped around the thick shoulder fabric of Ethan's jacket, right at the reinforced seam. His teeth locked down. Atlas snarled, not in aggression, but in determination, the primal sound of a creature refusing to lose the man he had chosen. Ethan felt the pull, felt his body shift, felt gravity lose its grip for the briefest moment. "Hold on, Atlas. Don't let go." Atlas didn't let go. He pulled with every ounce of strength his muscular frame could muster. The rope helped, but Atlas did more. He countered the slide, anchoring Ethan with brute instinct. Ethan scrambled upward, using his boots to claw for footholds. His free hand found the rope again. He hauled himself upward just as the rim gave way entirely, sending a cascade of earth down the shaft behind him. With one final heave, Atlas dragged Ethan's upper body over the collapsing edge. Ethan slammed onto the muddy ground, rolling away from the sinkhole as the entire mouth caved in with a roaring crash. Dirt exploded upward, spraying across his face. The sinkhole sealed shut behind them like it had never been open. Ethan lay on his back, chest heaving, rain falling into his open mouth as he gasped for breath. The retrieval pouch rested against his side, safe. Atlas stood over him, panting heavily, ears pinned back, his thick fur soaked and matted. The dog nudged Ethan's cheek with his nose, whining softly. "You crazy hero," Ethan managed, reaching up to grip the dog's muzzle. "You pulled me out of the dark again." The storm began to ease, the rain softening to a steady whisper. Ethan and Atlas sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what they carried heavier than the bag itself. The next morning, the town of Twin Pines gathered quietly at the Riley home. Martha Riley, now in her late 60s, greeted Ethan at the door. She was a slim woman with silver hair pulled into a loose bun, soft lines around her eyes that spoke of years of tears and years of waiting. She wore a simple wool cardigan and clutched a tissue in one trembling hand. Her voice wavered. "Mr. Cole, you said you had something for me?" Ethan nodded. He reached into his bag and withdrew a small, weathered item wrapped in cloth. The Arrow of Light badge Jacob Riley had earned shortly before his disappearance. He placed it gently in Martha's hands. She looked down at it. Her breath caught. Her fingers curled around the badge, and she pressed it to her chest. Tears spilled silently, trailing down her cheeks. She didn't collapse, didn't wail. She simply held the small emblem of her son's life and let the grief finally release. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for bringing him home." Ethan didn't trust his voice. He simply bowed his head. When he and Atlas stepped back out onto the quiet street, the sun had broken through the clouds for the first time in days. Ethan rested a hand on Atlas's head. "You and me," he murmured. "No more running from ghosts." Atlas leaned into his side, tail swaying softly. And in that small moment, Ethan realized the truth. He and Atlas were no longer two wounded souls drifting through the world. They were family, bound not by past tragedy, but by the courage of choosing to step out of darkness together.